So anyway, we initially started this discussion and the series of interviews, some of which that we're going to see today, as a way of just exploring this territory. And what we're finding is that it's a really rich territory, and we wanted to sort of it's turning into something of its own, meaning that we want to house these interviews on the PSI website as sort of a service for people that are looking to engage psychedelics for their healing. Um, and the idea being that I think it's a much more complicated picture than the one that gets portrayed in pop culture and in sort of the media circles, whether that's sort of a more kind of simple reading of the research that's out there that says one and done or three and done, or sort of generally people saying, oh, I went off and did this and now I don't have depression or something like that. We think that there's a lot more to it than that, and there's a lot more variation to it than that. And so we just want to sort of deepen the conversation and make that conversation, especially from people that are engaging in this from a mental health perspective, available to the general public. Anybody else want to chime in and just your thoughts about today?
I want to throw one more piece in there in terms of you mentioned trauma, developmental trauma, attachment trauma, etc. And where does the transpersonal versus PSI piece fit in? I want to throw one more piece into that. Is we're in a time right now where we're looking at in our world, creating and innovating in ways that have sort of a moral, integral fabric to it, that we're not exploiting the world, but we're instead creating a world that has integrity. It is able to kind of has a tapestry of holding each other together. And so my question is, to what degree does PSI access that type of signal of a sort of moral integrity and that sort of emerges to support something new in the world, as opposed to the transpersonal realm? And I think many people are going to the transpersonal realm to support their innovative capacities, their capacity to participate in the co-creation of the world in ways that offer moral reasoning and integrity. And so my question around this is like, well, to what degree where does PSI fit within that, in that pursuit?
And does that work? Is that effective if you're going to the transpersonal to find your moral signal? Right.
Yeah.
That's a great question. Okay. Anybody else, or should we just jump into some of the basics here? Yeah.
So just a quick reminder for everybody. If you have any questions, please make use of our Q&A button down there. If you're on a laptop, it should be down at the bottom of the screen. You can send in your questions and we'll get to your questions at some point during the panel discussion, and we'll have your Q&A, your questions answered later on. Okay? Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to bring up a couple of slides that might be familiar to people that have already trained with us, but hopefully, this is it'll be useful to re-look at that. Share screen.
Saj, before we begin, I think we should just give a brief introduction of everybody that's here.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. So how do we want to do this?
Maybe just have everybody on the panel just briefly introduce themselves and where they're located and what they're up to. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. Why don't we start with Jaya?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jaya. I'm a PSI instructor, and I'm located in the St. Louis and East Coast areas. And I offer trainings here in St. Louis and offer we'll be offering a training in the Virginia, DC area.
And Puerto Rico.
And Puerto Rico, forgot that, in December.
Mhm. Eric.
Hello, everyone. I'm Eric, and I'm on Sumas and Matsqui territory, which is pretty close to Vancouver, British Columbia. And I'm very excited to be here. I love talking about these three tiers of psychedelic healing. I think about it quite a bit, and I am going to be offering trainings in Europe this summer and fall, and I'm also very excited about that.
And Montreal.
In Montreal, right?
That's my role here. Add the little. Thanks, Eric. Carrie.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carrie Gleiser. At the moment, I'm calling in from Hanover, New Hampshire, but just about ready to move to Italy, where I'm actually an instructor in training or apprentice. So I'm going to be observing Eric, who's going to do a training in Italy, in Tuscany, and then hoping also to offer trainings in Italy in the coming years. And I'm also excited to be here. I think this topic is so timely and so important, and just it can help us clarify some of these kind of nebulous concepts of healing and, growth and transformation. I think we're good at talking in these broad brushstrokes, but really being able to zoom in and clarify what we actually mean by this and what are the different pathways that people are pursuing and what does it all mean just feels super essential. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Carrie. I think if we walk away from today with even just more definition and clarity on what we're looking at here, I think that's time well spent. Great.
Agreed.
Thank you. Daniel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel. I'm based in Los Angeles. I'm an instructor out here, and my private practice is out here as well. Very excited about this topic, this discussion. This was on the white paper for PSIP, and this is what caught my attention initially and got me into the training, the distinction around these different tiers. And I have my own personal experiences exploring these different territories, not knowing there's certain things that might be necessary in order to go into the transpersonal spaces. So I think this discussion will be very rich and very excited for all of this.
Yay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here and contributing to the conversation. Okay. All right. And Jean, we did have a hand up. Should we go with that? Just it sounds like somebody had a question before we start.
Nope, not seeing any hands up, but if anybody has a question that they'd like to raise now, just please feel free to raise your hand or put it in our Q&A. No?
Right.
No, not seeing anyone. Okay.
Okay, folks. So again, this is a concept that we initially published in our white paper that was published in the Journal of Psychedelic Psychiatry. And it is, first of all, let me just say that there's no research to back this. This is a completely speculative model that's based on our anecdotal experience. And so it's both sort of kind of laying out these tiers of human development that psychedelics can operate inside of. Yeah. And I think what we're doing with it in the PSIP model is suggesting that, for the mental health population, and perhaps there's different ways of defining that, but for people who are experiencing mental health symptoms, for them to enter into the psychedelic world, there might be this might be a good trajectory for that type of person. Yeah, so that's the basics of it. We expect that, that maybe this model needs to be changed and will alter the further we get into the world of, providing psychedelic treatments to people. And we got a hand up. So Benjamin, why don't we'll go with yours? Or Gene? Or
N- Not seeing any hands.
okay. Or just stick it for now, just let's continue then and go ahead and pop your question in the chat.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. So folks, the basics of this is that so I will say that typically what happens in the psychedelic world is that people come in at the very top of the pyramid, which we'll get to, which is the transpersonal space. So that's one of the big conversations of today. But we are articulating a couple of layers beneath that that again I think are going to be useful here. So let's just kind of go through and define what we're looking at. So tier one, we're referring to as body or foundation or our psychobiology. Yeah. And it's the focus of what is going on in tier one is on the disturbances, I should say, that happen in tier one are the stressful events, the overwhelming events, the traumatic events in a person's life that really will cause um you know biological disturbances in terms of nervous system responses. It creates dissociation. It creates psychological disturbances in terms of developing a healthy ego structure. Being a functioning human being in the world. And so this is sort of that layer that we will have cracks in at times when particularly if well okay, let me just stay with this slide. Right, so this is the stressful, the traumatic events, the developmental wounding like attachment disorders that will translate into psychobiological nervous system compromise. And folks, what I mean by nervous system compromise is the fact that if you get into a relationship, you have to become numb, or there's so much sort of anxiety or ambivalence or fear that you might have experienced in your early relationships, that when you get into a relationship as an adult, then it comes with a lot of nervous system reactivity that your mind is managing, right? You're looking like you're under control and everything, but inside there's a whole lot that's going on in the system, right? Including numbing out, including dissociation. Yeah. So point B here, the focus here is that we are looking to resolve this psychobiological level of compromise. This is where, if you know the PSIP work, this is where we're going through waves. Your nervous system is moving from dissociative states to highly activated states to calm, neutral, yummy, good states. The focus here is your biographical self, your history, your childhood, right? This is a human realm. This is a highly, highly relational realm. So much of the wounding that takes place here happens in human relationship. Yeah. So medicines that we find good for this layer are cannabis and MDMA, because they are very embodied medicines. They tend not to have a mystical scope, right? They tend not to go into the transpersonal realms. When I was part of the MAPS trials, we would give people the Johns Hopkins expanded states of consciousness survey, where during their MDMA journey, did people see religious figures or symbolism or some kind of that realm, and most people did not. And so what that's telling us is you do not have to have that sort of transpersonal experience in order to heal from trauma. Yeah. And then the final point on this slide is that this does require a very, I would say, a well-held individual focus. This is not a group focus that we're talking about here. Again, speculative, right? So take it all with a grain of salt. Tier two is something I would say somewhat unique, that's not well represented in the psychedelic world. This is the realm of personality. We call it fabric because we're talking about the very basic fabric of reality, your very basic sense of how you are put together and how the world is put together that you thought was unconditioned, right? You thought you were seeing something sort of just rock solid and true about the world. And in tier two processes, that that solidity starts to come apart, right? So there's a big deconstruction that happens and then a reconstruction that happens. So let me give you I think the best way to describe what's happening in tier two is, you know, in tier one, you're dealing with the events that create trauma and compromise in your system. In tier two, you're dealing with the self that got created in response to those events. So a nice way to distinguish this is, imagine that, like, somebody has, relatively stable, secure, safe childhood. And when this person's 19 years old, they get into a bad car accident or are assaulted, right? So in that case, that person's going to have a disturbance at tier one, right? Their nervous system is going to have charge. They're going to be affected by that car accident or the assault. What is not going to happen to that person is that their very sense of personality, their very core sense of themselves or the world is not going to be up for grabs. That's not a level that's being shaken when people have that kind of experience. Now, contrast that to this scenario where, let's say, trauma, neglect, abuse, abandonment is going on, but it's going on while the psyche is being formed, right? So imagine that that type of disturbance is going on for a 1-year-old, right? Their very sense of self, their very sense of the world around them is being constructed, is being formed inside of trauma. And so it makes sense then when that trauma begins to get addressed or resolved later in life with psychedelics, then the very sense of self and very sense of world that got formed inside of that trauma bubble is also going to be very affected. Yeah. So hopefully that makes sense. So in other words, fabric layer involves much more, I would say, developmental trauma that really kind of, forms that very maybe object relations is a good way of talking about this, like that really core sense of 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 self. So point B here, right? Again, this is personal, biographical, psychological realm of processing that's taking place here. I think the medicines that are very useful here are ketamine, psilocybin, the classic tryptamine. They're doing something that the cannabis and MDMA does not do, right? So I think what just kind of adding to the picture here, one of the things that we had a sense of in the MAPS trial was that MDMA did not challenge personality. Somebody had personality level issues going on, MDMA would not challenge that. In fact, you could have, like a narcissistic personality disorder or features of it, or borderline personality disorder. What you can see is that those adaptations that people have that are, tier two adaptations, their personality level adaptations, can take something like MDMA and just, hijack it essentially, mop the floor. The MDMA process will not challenge that personality. So point D here highlighted in orange, highly destabilizing, again, deconstruction and then reconstruction of self and reality, requires a lot of support and requires a lot of strong foundational ego strength. One of the things that we see in the PSIP world is that people's systems do not open the door to tier two processing unless there's enough stability and integration and healing that's been done at tier one, right? So another way of saying that is, if your nervous system is releasing a lot of endogenous opioids and you're dissociating a lot in your life to the things that have happened to you, then, you know, sort of organically, your system is not then going to open the door to, you know, processing personality level disturbances. It's just, you know, I think that's a nice self-regulatory mechanism that's in place here. Requires individual focus, not group work. Personality shifts happen here. Folks, I think a good movie that I often cite that kind of that speaks to what's happening in tier 2 can be it's probably like 20 years old now, Shutter Island with Leonardo DiCaprio, where there's I won't go into details of it, but there's kind of a real disorienting flipping back and forth between realities. And I think that's what people experience when they're in tier 2. They don't know what's real, whether sort of the self and the world of their childhood is real, or this new self and new world that's emerging through the psychedelic process is real. And oftentimes I will recommend that our students choose to not work. Let me repeat that again, to not work with tier 2 material just yet, simply because I think it requires much more maturity for us as a culture moving into the psychedelic world. I think it requires much more holding capacity. Does anybody on the panel want to comment on either of these so far?
Yeah, I'll just add a little perspective around the phenomenology of dissociation, because I think when you're working in tier 1 and you're working with material that is hidden, invisible, unwanted, avoided, it's almost like a landscape of kind of absences, right? Like stuff that gets disowned or dispossessed or unclaimed. And I feel like you need that material, right? People often don't want to approach it because of the remnants that it leaves in the body, the residue, the activation, right? So that's why people dissociate. They get it out of consciousness. But it feels like that material, I mean, taking kind of a construction metaphor, you need that material. That's part of the building blocks that you need to then bring forward in tier 2. So if you try to bypass or skip tier 1 or body, you're trying to do something kind of with incomplete materials, and you're going to get a holy, not holy H-O-L-Y, but holy W-O-W-H-O-L-E-Y. You're going to get a holy construction. It's going to have the same holes that you started with. So that's why I so appreciate this conceptualization. When I first read it, it had this moment of just, yes, why hasn't this been articulated before? Of course, it's hierarchical. And of course, we need the material, we need the memories, we need the body sensations, we need the understandings, we need even the little pieces of identity from tier 1 that are then available to be integrated, inserted, understood, synthesized, worked through kind of in an organizational way in tier 2. So I love the conceptualization of this model, and it feels like it's been a missing piece of psychedelic healing for a long time, maybe forever. I've never heard it articulated quite this way, and it really felt like a light bulb going off the first time I read the white paper.
I just want to ditto what I'm also seeing and hearing here, Saj. Just how fundamental it is to go into body, and like Carrie was saying, is like pulling out of dissociation or reassociating with all of this material has to be there as almost a fundamental step before you can go into the fabric, before you can go into that tier 2, because that's where tier 2 emerges, is out of the dissociation. You begin to start questioning your reality. It's like, what's real, what's not real. It's almost like a sort of a mini psychotic breakdown that starts to emerge as you're beginning to question yourself, question the world around you. And it is very destabilizing. And I can imagine, like, and people want to get to that place. They want to begin to emerge as a new sense of self, but not understanding the containment and the holding and the support that's required to get there. Otherwise, I think you can just end up looping and getting caught and stuck. So I just want to kind of name what you're saying, which is like, be cautious and caring to your own nervous system, and respect the dissociation, respect the tears, and know that that there's a reason why dissociation was put in place. There's a reason why biology put the dissociation in place. And so if we try to hammer through it, it's going to create too much destabilization.
The
Agreed.
metaphor that I really like to use is a house. It's kind of adding on to your construction metaphor, Carrie, that it doesn't make sense to do a lot of renovation of the upper level of a house if the foundation is cracked and damaged. It doesn't make sense to put a new roof on the top if you're not sitting on a good foundation. It doesn't make good sense to change all the rooms and the kitchen and everything. You know, you really got to make sure that foundation is solid.
Love it. I had almost exactly the same language in my mind and metaphor in my mind. That feels like it nails it.
It also, that metaphor also speaks to the type of work that tier 1 is, that you don't just lift up a house, throw in a new foundation, and boom, you're ready to go. Like, you know, it's a big project to change a foundation. There's necessary destabilization. You need to find the damage. You need to be carefully attending to it in an ongoing way while you're trying to live in this destabilized house.
Mm-hmm.
One other piece I'd like to add to it, like the necessary pieces that need to be moved through in tier 1, right? These parts that's been dissociated, disconnected from us. But I think moving through those pieces, this foundational layer, also creates a lot of opportunity to build out necessary solution. And a common solution that we explore within PSIP is relational solution. So if we're going to tier 2, where the fabric of one's reality is being disturbed, and the destabilization that comes with that, building out enough relational solution, the possibility that someone could be there while that deconstruction happens, I think is a necessary step for that container.
Mhm.
I
Absolutely.
want to throw one last piece in there, which is, for many individuals, they think that, not all, but many will think that they can do this work and their external world won't need to be adapted. And yet the external world is a reflection of their internal world, right? And so as they deconstruct, as you tear down the house and build the house back up, the external world has to change. And I think that's also another reason why it can get very destabilizing, is it's not just the inner world that gets reconstructed. The outside world is a reflection of that inner. So as the inner world is being like pulled down, there's changes that need to happen in a person's lives. And that can be very scary for some individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I think why tier 2 is so destabilizing is because, you know, you, like, what's stable, what's solid? If you yourself are in motion and fluid, and then there is a reflection between sort of your inner world and the outer world, as Jaya was talking about. It's all shifting, right? So, and yeah, love everything that you're all saying with this. Yeah, we need container to deal with this, and ultimately, I think the theme that Carrie mentioned at the beginning, that if you're moving from the foundation of the house to these other layers of the house, and there's massive holes that are in the foundation, then those holes are going to be represented further in the system. Yeah, that's, you don't all of a sudden, like, you don't have massive dissociation going on at the level of body, the foundation, and then, have like a smooth tier 2 or tier 3 experience.
I want to add one.
Go ahead, Gia.
So, okay, I'm going to suggest, my theory is, this is one of many reasons why people bypass this work and try to access it through the transpersonal. Because so I'm just going to throw that out there. Is, for some individuals, this can be so terrifying that instead they're trying to find the shortcut.
Oh yeah, it's terrifying. Let's just, there's a reason why it's called trauma at the tier 1 material. There's a reason why, there's a lot of treatment resistance, and many people do not heal. It's terrifying. Yeah, Carrie?
Saj, there was kind of an implicit question a minute ago that you posed about, like, why, or maybe it wasn't a question, but I heard a question in there about kind of what in tier 1 can be, if not stabilizing, not that it circumvents the destabilization of stage 2 or tier 2, but maybe supports it. And I had this vision of like body and connection, like what Eric was saying about relational resourcing and relational solution being a scaffolding, right? Because it really feels like, even as tier 2 might feel somewhat destabilizing, like, okay, there's no, where the self is now in question, the personality is now loosening, it's coming apart a little. Where is the container for that? And I think really, if you've done the tier 1 work, that the body, right, I'm struggling to find the language, because like the transformations that have happened in the body, the recovery of material and solution and resources in the body and in connection. So I even wondered if like maybe tier 1 needs to be body and connection, since so much of it is relational resourcing or body and relationship, because it really feels like those are the trusses. Trusses, is that the word? That like really kind of stabilize the system, that then let things kind of come apart a little in tier 2.
Yeah. Yeah, relationship's a huge part of, I think, ultimately all of these, right? We're carrying relationship into all of these, and that can be external relationships, but that can also be intrapsychic relationships, right? Like, I think some of the wounding that happens at tier 1 is people have a really distrusting intrapsychic level of relationship. They don't distrust their own process, their own inner world, their own bodies are their have a very antagonistic relationship with their own bodies.
I love this point. It's almost like I'm hearing like two things. How can you hold the destabilization in tier 2 unless you've got some pillars of relationship that you're able to anchor into, and that trust in that interpsychic solution of like the signal that's organizing your life? Without those two things, that destabilization of tier 2 is going to suck you in like undercurrent of an ocean.
And potentially, again, I'm kind of curious if people have been finding this to be different for you, but to a large extent, I don't see tier 2 opening up without those foundational layers in place for people, which, I mean, in the mental health world, when we talk about tier 2, what used to be called maybe access to, like we have DBT, we have management strategies for that. We don't have any sense that I think we could actually work with and really, cure personality level disturbances in traditional mental health.
Saj, there's a question here that I think is worth addressing, that I think can be addressed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Destabilization that happens in tier 2 less likely if one has done sufficient tier 1 work. And I think we're all in agreement with that, but I also think it's important to really understand the depth of tier 1 work that we're talking about. We're talking about dissociation. That dissociation with tier 1 work really needs to be addressed in order to manage or to go into the destabilization of the tier 2 work. And the question is, isn't the destabilization that happens in tier 2 less likely? I don't think the goal is to avoid it. I think it's a necessary part of tier 2. Yeah. It's not about it not happening. It's about having the support and the foundation to move through it.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a difference between destabilization and collapse, right? If you're renovating your first floor, you're going to tear some stuff down, right? And that's going to be destabilizing. But if things just kind of start collapsing willy-nilly around you that aren't intentional or aren't you know, part of the master plan, then that can start to feel like a different level of loss of control and
Mm.
chaos. And so that's where I feel like the tier one supports, maybe they support destabilization, but they also forestall collapse, because you don't want the collapse of a system.
Right. Like you want the tools to be put in place for the reconstruction to happen.
Right.
Because
Right.
I do think
Mhm.
some people do fall into tier two even without doing tier one work. If
Mm.
they use the right medicines and they pressurize it in a certain way, the thing is when that deconstruction happens, like is there utility to it? If there's not the container, if there's not the pillars and the tools to organize someone's system to reconstruct the new self, is that actually helpful for the individual? And I think it's not uncommon for people to have those experiences when they fly out to Peru and have 8 ceremonies that come back just completely
Yeah.
destabilized and confused and not having a container to move into it. And I think one of the students that gave the interview, I think that we'll be watching, touches on some of those pieces as well. So I think that would be quite nice to complement this conversation.
Mhm. I would agree. I feel like I'm one of those people who have done it both ways, where got exposed to my own tier two, but didn't have the containment to do it, and it caused extreme looping and pulling me into old addictions and compulsions and attempting to glue myself back together. And it was a very agonizing process. And I've done it the appropriate way, where I've created the appropriate container through the process. So I can, yeah. And then you have, when you are destabilized and you don't have the container, you're desperate to get out of that. So then you start reaching for these psychedelics and the transpersonal to kind of glue yourself back together. So just, it can be quite a process of madness without the right psychoeducation and containment.
Yeah. Folks, again, loving this conversation, right? So I think um, we have limited experience with this, but I love that what you're bringing to the table, that, yeah, maybe there are ways where you can just sort of, have, 8 big medicine experiences, and perhaps that really does open up tier two for people, override sort of the natural uh, assessment that the system has to say, don't open this layer, and it can get opened for some people. Yeah. Okay, great. Let's move on to finally tier three, which again, I think this is, what many people are much more familiar with, and what we're going to be talking about a lot today is transcendence, right? The ocean. This is the everything. This is you, but it is so much more than you, right? This is the cosmos. This is the universe. It's transpersonal, unity consciousness. I would call it, my experience of tier three is, kind of a reconciliation with the existential, sort of a reconciliation with the ground of being, that can, the type of healing that can happen there is, your sense of the world can really be altered into, you could, I'll just speak personally, but, for many, many years, I was an atheist, and sort of going into and then having tier three work, I just had this experience of, wow, the world is alive and intelligent in ways that I just did not perceive at all before, you know? Um, so I would say this is not the realm of psychotherapy versus tier one and tier two, body and fabric. Definitely mental health, definitely biographical processes that deal with you, your history, your childhood, your attachment, all of that. But tier three, nope. Um, in fact, I think there's tier three is kind of not interested in you, right? It's interested in the processes. They are interested in having you connect to something so much bigger than you. This is, I think, the realm of awe and mystery. Um, it's worship, right? It's just pure adoration of being and all that exists. Psilocybin and classic tryptamines are ideal for this layer. I think, you know, uh, moderate to high doses will work here. I think to a large degree, people have moved beyond the body at this point when they're having transpersonal experiences. So one question that we have in the PSIP community is, can you use psilocybin for the type of processing that we do? And the answer is yes, you can, but you have to go much lower dose with it. Um, and and then the final point here is that, this is, I think, more ideal if it's group work. This is typically, I think, what gets when people are having, a sitter with them, this is the type of work that they're doing. This is why, the sitter is kind of a passive holding container. There's not much interaction. There's no interventions. There's no real maps or, things that are taking place. The sitter is just kind of outside of the psychedelic consciousness of the participant. And the magic in tier 3 is an encounter between the participant's consciousness and the medicine, right? Versus, what's happening in tiers 1 and 2 is it's an encounter between the the participant's consciousness, the medicine, plus human relationship, plus the therapist, the PSIP therapist in particular, is an active participant in the psychedelic consciousness of the client in both tier 1 and tier 2. In tier 3, that's not the case. And as a consequence, we don't do a whole lot with tier 3 in the PSIP model, in the PSIP training, simply because, again, it's very well represented. And I think ultimately the suggestion here, of why we're kind of building these foundational levels is that, it's a good idea if you're going to, for you to have a lot of trauma in your system, a lot of dissociation, a lot of personality level disturbances going on, and then going into tier 3 or, the ocean, which is, I think, typically what happens in the world. And, that can blow people out. That can, even the revelations, the experiences that happen there, I think it's much more difficult to sort of bring those back home with you, bring those, translate the revelations of tier 3 into an embodied existence when your embodied existence is full of dissociation and full of trauma, right? So the suggestion here is that it's a very different experience to approach the transpersonal from a position of wholeness, from a position of, like, you're not dissociating all over the place in your life. And then you approach God from that position versus approaching God and you're just kind of, like, fragmented ego being held together in some ways. Yeah, yeah. So again, let's open it up. Thoughts, folks? And maybe this is the big picture here that we're looking at. But so if you want to touch on this a little bit or not at all, we could also just kind of move to the interview. So whatever you all want.
I just have a question for all of you guys around this is, so we know in the PSI model, we talked about the interpsychic capacity to trust in that signal that's sort of guiding the organism towards wholeness, to restoring its sense of self. And so in some ways, someone might consider, I've heard clients in the past say, well, that's sort of a transpersonal process. Like you're accessing something greater than yourself, right? It has this innate intelligence to it that is guiding your life. It's orchestrating your life. It's restoring order. And in some ways, that for some, that's the definition of God. That's the definition of the divine, is something bigger than themselves, that restoring them to sanity, restoring them to wholeness. So I'm questioning how what we do and what we help people do, which is access that intelligence, how do we define that? Can that be held as a transpersonal space, or does it really matter? Do we need to consider that?
Well, I love thinking about this kind of thing. Some spiritual teachers would say that your essential self is pure awareness, the awareness that's there before any thinking, sensation, story, feeling. So for me, that pure awareness is a link to transpersonal that's somehow meeting, I think, it's the transpersonal meeting the nervous system in incredibly intimate way. I haven't thought of the signal in the nervous system being part of transpersonal, but I think it's all consciousness. That's my personal belief. So there's some kind of pure awareness meeting some kind of innate signal together that is the magic of the piece of work.
Maybe the word
Yes.
pre-personal applies? Like it's a pre-personal signal, but potentially it's coming from the same place. Yeah, Carrie.
I love the question. And I wonder if we're dancing a little around this concept of like core self, which isn't really like identity or ego based, but it's kind of this guiding, wise inner force that abides in all of us. And Peace Up, we trust to hold the reins, along with the guide or the therapist or, whoever is holding the process relationally. And I think maybe the difference of like someone who's using the transpersonal to bypass versus to guide through trauma. I think about like if there's like a big blob of trauma kind of in the path, and someone is using this like transpersonal inner awareness or self to go around it or to try to fly over it or fly above it versus using that presence to move through it, so that like essentially it's enhancing connectivity. If you're letting it enhance connectivity and guide you through connectivity, then yes, I totally think that that's almost like marrying tier 1 and tier 3 or bridging or somehow threading through. Because again, I don't think it helps us to reify these tiers as like completely separate entities. You can be in body and be doing tier 1 work and maybe get a glimpse of the transpersonal or a glimpse of the oceanic, or on the other side of a deep piece of processing, you feel awe and interconnected with everything, and that's part of the healing process. So I think we have to leave some wiggle room for these phenomenon to communicate with each other and to intersperse with each other and to kind of thread through a little, even though I think it's super helpful to talk about them as different tiers.
Yeah.
Shaz, I wonder, I see that there's like a division here that almost looks like there's a light and a shadow to each of these tiers. I don't know if that's intentional or if it was just artistic.
Graphic artist, totally.
Okay.
Randomness of
Because I did think like, especially in the tier 3, that there can be like a real light side and a real dark side, that if you are trying to use tier 3 to bypass or escape, or that there's some compelling addictive quality to I'm getting out of body in oceanic space, or I'm getting into interconnectivity as a way of avoiding connecting with my own self, my own true deep self, then that feels like a bit of a dark side to tier 3.
Yeah. Yeah.
You would think that so if you have some sort of force inside of you, inside of all of us, like if you just think of complex systems, all complex systems have a signal that is guiding that system, whether it's an individual, whether it's a family, whether it's an organization, whether it's a society. It's that signal, that intelligence is greater than the individual. It's greater than the family, and it is moving through the system in a way in which it's almost, I would almost say, like desperate to reorganize itself, to restore it to sanity, to restore it to greater wholeness and order. And that's within us all, right? And my hunch is that when we override it or gag it or muffle it, it's like Mother Nature's boss, like the signal can make our life a little miserable because it's really wanting to restore that order. So then we'd have to reach for those transpersonal spaces to almost get some relief from how this signal or how this this intelligence is pushing us and nudging us towards heading into the aspects of life that haven't been integrated. And so I would imagine you'd have almost like a push pull, reaching for some of these transpersonal places to gain some sense of, I don't know, avoidance and managing, and then being thrust back into whatever material is attempting to emerge because it's trying to emerge in order to be restored. So you get this back and forth yin yang of experience, as opposed to hanging on to this signal, this intelligence that's sort of transpersonal, and trusting that it's going to guide you through the nightmare, then guide you through the material, so you can have more yourself. Your family can come together in a greater level. The organization can restore itself, etc. So it's like, what is the point of the transpersonal? Is it to anchor us so we can head into the darkness, or is the transpersonal meant to override it?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a fantastic question. And I think a lot of times what we tend to see is that people that are very oriented towards the transpersonal have a way of, I don't know, dismissing is maybe a good word, dismissing the personal, dismissing the biographical, dismissing ego as the thing that causes suffering. I think there's lots of spiritual traditions that will dismiss the ego as the cause of suffering. And my question when I conceive of this is that true? I mean, why do we have these systems that seem to have such a antagonistic relationship between different parts of our being? Meaning that, yes, the transpersonal, the absolute reality is absolutely there, right? It's this really big, true thing that we encounter. And then the relative small self reality seems to also be true for us, right? It's where these kind of complicated beings that live in different realms like this that don't seem to make any kind of rational or linear sense, but they're not mutually exclusive. It seems to me we have a small self and a big self reality. And I think any time that we go into one and it seems to be demonizing or alienating or suggesting that this other reality is not valid, seems to me that's not a holistic, it's not an actual holistic picture of what's going on.
Absolutely. In this incarnation, we may, have our holy selves, but we can't ever escape our animal selves, right? Like there is the beast of the body, and all the ways that we've been shaped by our experiences. And I feel like dismissing feels more like that. If someone's dismissing those kind of, I don't even want to say lower selves, because that's a value judgment, or the smaller selves, that we need to tweak our language around this, because they're just other aspects of self. And if you're dismissing, you're not transcending, you're just relegating to the unconscious, right? You're still going to be jerked around by the puppet strings of those experiences. You're just pretending, right? And that's inherently dissociative. So I feel like we're sketching out some of these different tricks of the mind that, or the justifications or rationalizations that people use when they want to jump to tier 3, like, oh, all that stuff, all those emotions, all those lesser, identity constructs, oh, that ego, or these earthly, ties. If you're dismissing in a way that's pushing away, there's going to be a very impoverished sliver of self, that's getting to tier 3. It's not going to be an accepting, whole, surrendered, integrated self that's rising to that level.
Yeah.
It speaks to the term, it speaks to the like the Holy Spirit or the integral spirit. Like it's like integrating the many moving parts of life. Isn't that like, what does wholeness mean? It's integration, the many moving parts of life, many moving parts of the psyche, the ego, the body, relationship, heading into the
Shadow,
past,
the
present.
pain.
Exactly. That's the holiness of the spirit, the integrate. Yeah. So
This is
Yeah.
so fun, you guys. I have to say, such great conversation. Feels so juicy.
One thing that becomes clear, like within PSIP, is there's necessary conditions that need to be put in place to go into the nightmare, right? And a lot of times it is relational solution. So it makes me wonder when there is this dismissing of the small self, how much of that is being like driven by the futility that one might like feel or think in finding some resolution in that world. And if that was like if that wasn't so hopeless and there was like possibility around that, would that lead to a different type of fluidity between these different tiers, right? Like what is it that's getting in the way of the fluidity of these tiers and leading them to separate?
Mhm.
I love it, Daniel. No, I think you're right on with that. There's true deep hopelessness that people can live in at these maybe tier one that's part of a nervous system response and you had throughout your entire childhood, and you don't think it'll ever move. And the only hope, the only solution that somebody comes up with is, oh, if I become spirit, if I become disembodied, if I become this big thing. And yeah, I'm loving this conversation because it's like really kind of saying, like, anytime you feel like you have to chop a part of yourself off to to go someplace, to exist in some dimension, like that's suspicious, right? We should be suspicious of any time like a process is asking us, we think that we have to, relegate some part of ourselves to the shadow.
Mhm.
There's an interesting interview between Gabor Mate and Adi Ashanti that happened a few years ago. I think it's on the Sound podcast, where Gabor Mate is saying, what about all these supposedly enlightened spiritual teachers that are crossing relational boundaries? What's going on here? And to his credit, Adi Ashanti says, well, I don't think they're dealing with the psychological realms here, and so they're supposedly enlightened beings who don't know how to be really human and relational, and that is part of the shadow side of tier 3 for sure.
Mm. Yeah, I think the way that we articulate that in the PSIP world is, somebody who knows the face of God but can't be in a relationship. So yeah, gets reactive when they're truly called to open in a relationship. Okay, wonderful, folks. This is so rich. Thank you. Shall we move on to our first interview?